is Doug DeMuro, and today we're going to answer the question, will old cars die off with old car enthusiasts? Meaning cars from the 40s, 50s, 60s, are they just going to be worthless and pushed aside as kind of the new generation of car enthusiasts takes over and some of the people who are more into those cars kind of pass away? And that's a question I get asked a lot, and let's talk about it. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era with free listings. You can list your cool car for free and auction it on Cars and Bids. And we've had some great sales recently, including this fantastic BMW wagon sold for just under $30,000. We've done great with BMW wagons on Cars and Bids. This wonderful Lexus SC430 sold for $28,000. We've also surprisingly done well with these, and this great Honda S2000 brought $36,000. Good money. This one was supercharged. A great car. If you're looking to buy or sell a cool enthusiast car from the modern era, the 1980s and up, Cars and Bids is the place to do it. With daily auctions and free listings, check it out at carsandbids.com. Okay, so will old cars die off with old car enthusiasts? It's an interesting thing to think about when you think about car enthusiasm and kind of where it's going to go in the future. And I get asked this question frequently by people. What's going to happen to these 60s cars that are so idolized now when the baby boomers die off? These people who are born in the 40s, who grew up with those cars, they're very special. A lot of those cars are owned by those people now. Where are those cars going to end up? What is going to be the level of enthusiasm for those cars when people my age kind of get older? Are they still going to be desirable? And I think it's an interesting question. And I think the answer that a lot of these people should come to terms with is that, yeah, I think to an extent, a lot of these older cars are going to die off. I don't think there's going to be a lot of interest for a lot of these cars, which are kind of considered to be very special, very vaunted 60s special cars right now. And frankly, I think we're already seeing this start to happen with like brass era cars, right? Cars from the 1910s, 20s, even the 30s. The people who were into those, they're not around anymore. And I don't think there's a lot of enthusiasm among a lot of people of keeping those cars on the road. And they're difficult to keep on the road. They're not easy to drive. They're not easy to look after. You got to know what you're doing. And so people are starting to see values of those cars kind of decline and interest in those cars decline. And cars that were once important special cars from that era are often kind of ignored by younger people. Frankly, even including the baby boomers who were born in the 40s, 50s, a lot of them don't want anything to do with the 1910s, 20s cars. It's just not interesting to them. And I think that gives us a good preview of what's going to happen to 40s, 50s, 60s cars as the next generation kind of ages in. I really do. I really think that it's hard to believe, as it might be, some of these 60s cars that are considered so special by the group that really goes after them now may not be loved quite as much by the next group, and the brass era cars are kind of a good example of that happening. But with that said, I want to make a point here. I do think that some cars are an exception to this. So brass era cars, right? People who are younger, in their 30s, 40s, they look at those and they think they all look the same. They're all disasters. They all go 9 miles an hour. I don't want anything to do with those. I don't think it's quite the same for 50s, 60s, and 70s cars. Some cars from this era, 50s, 60s, 70s specifically, are icons, like iconic cars in the history of the car. Now that's also kind of true of brass era cars, but they're just not as rewarding. Specifically, Mercedes-Benz Gullwing. That's an iconic car that will never lose some of that following. The split window Corvettes, iconic design, one of the most beautiful cars of all time. The Jaguar E-Type, one of the most beautiful cars of all time. Tail fin Cadillacs from the 50s, big old thin Cadillacs. Very iconic cars from an era that's very, very special. 60s Ferraris, 250 LMs, 250 GTOs, short wheelbases, all very special and desirable cars. And to me, I think that even though some cars from this era, most cars from this era, the 50s, 60s, will lose their appeal, I truly can't imagine a world in which you look at like 250 LM and nobody wants it. It's just they were too special, they were too desirable, they were too iconic, and unlike the brass era cars, they're beautiful. 60s cars existed in a world without regulations, you know? They could do whatever they wanted to in terms of design, and they did. And that was an era of unbelievably attractive and beautiful cars, the split windows and the E-types and all those cars. And so I think that some of the iconic cars will always be considered iconic by many age groups to come. Probably not in 200 years, they'll be relics. But in the next generation, the generation after, if Ferrari's still a thing, Corvettes are still a thing, you go back and look at where that stuff started, you still want to be a part of that, especially because it was just so damn cool. So I think that's one distinction between brass era cars and, you know, the 60s stuff that's awesome. Chevy Bel Airs are cool. C1 Corvettes are cool. They look like rocket ships inside. Like, those are neat cars that I think will endure. Now, the lesser stuff that does still get a lot of excitement and interest, I think will start to die off. Stuff that is not iconic, I think people won't continue to pursue and will start to lose value. I think some of these people who are hoarding these cars or who are very excited about these cars will have to come to terms with the fact that some of the younger people just aren't as interested. But I think the real icon cars will survive, maybe not as valuable as they are now. Maybe there's a day where a 250 GTO isn't worth $75 million, or where an E-Type isn't a $100,000 to $200,000 car, or a Dino isn't a $500,000 car. Those may start to slow down as you have less competition for them, but I think there will always be a market of people out there. I mean, if Gullwings ever got cheap, I'd get one. And I'm not into 50s cars, I'm not into that stuff, but like, it's an icon, it's a cool car, you'd want to be a part of it. And an important thing to point out is a lot of these cars had pretty good performance. Not amazing performance, but like versus brass era cars, which go 14 miles an hour, like a 60s Corvette is still pretty cool. It sounds good, it's relatively quick. Same deal with the Ferraris in this era, the Gullwing. They had acceptable performance and iconic designs. Now, with that said, speaking of performance, one interesting thing. The performance is fine, it was good, it was nice, some of them were pretty fast, but it's not like amazing. And something I've always thought about with cars from this era is, okay, you have these cars that have these engines that are becoming mechanically complex, so you're having trouble finding people to work on them. The performance isn't like up to modern car levels, but you have this iconic look. The Gullwings, the E-Types, these are beautiful, you know, the original Camaros, the original Mustangs, beautiful cars, very special designs that designers now are still trying to emulate. So what's going to happen with that? And I often think to myself whether electrification will start to come to these cars. No, I don't think that 250 GTOs will ever be electrified. But you think about old Mustangs, right? Like, that car looks really cool. But who wants to keep one of those on the road? And even if you do, with the engine that it had, it's carbureted and it's slow. Wouldn't it be cooler to have all of the benefit of the style, plus put in a modern electric powertrain, which makes the car both faster and more reliable? And some people are gonna be watching this video and be like, that's sacrilege, I would never do that. But like, okay, they made hundreds of thousands of those Mustangs. It's not like that's ruining anything. Like E-Types, same way. They made tens of thousands of E-Types and they all were preserved somehow and they're all in nice shape. And you see 20 of them at every event. There's a market out there to make these cars modern day fast, put a Tesla powertrain in an E-Type. That'd be cool. And it makes them more reliable. And I really wonder if long-term, some of the strategy for some of these electric cars is going to be electrification. You're already starting to see it. There are already companies popping up that are electrifying some of the lesser cars. You're seeing it in Volkswagen Bugs. You're seeing it in Karmann Ghias, some early 911s. Some Volkswagen buses are getting electrified. I wouldn't be surprised if that really spreads to more cars. Younger people are going to embrace electrification in a way that the older crowd isn't. And when younger people age into this world where they can afford some of these cars, they're going to look at them and say, yeah, I would love to have an E-Type or a split window, but they're so, nobody even works on cars like this anymore. And then they're going to start thinking, well, wait a minute, I have a plug in my garage. I could just plug it into my Tesla charger and drive around in a split window that does 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. How cool would that be? And I think there's something to be said for that. And I wouldn't be surprised if electrification has some effect at preserving these cars' shelf life for longer than we might think, because the powertrains get outdated and this becomes a thing that people start to pursue with some of these older cars. But anyway, there you go. A lot of people ask me this question and that's my take. Yes, I do think that the interest in these older 50s, 60s, 70s cars will start to wane, just like it has with cars from earlier eras. At the end of the day, the people keeping that enthusiasm alive is a lot of times the people who lived in that era. And ultimately, younger people didn't. We want cars like this in a lot of cases. And so it makes more sense that those 60s, 70s cars, even as iconic as we view them now, will start to lose some interest. But I really think two important things. The icon cars will always stick around, like I mentioned. They may not be quite as valuable as they are now, but there will always be demand for split windows and Ferraris and first-gen Camaros, all that stuff. And I also think that electrification is something that people are going to start turning to more and more. Even though it sounds like sacrilege to get rid of V8s and loud exhaust, I think it's going to be tough. There's going to be emission laws. There's going to be a general familiarity with electric cars that people have. And it's going to kind of send people to electrify some of these classics. And I think that's going to happen down the line. And it may preserve some of these cars long term as like, wow, the beautiful style with a modern electric power plant. That's my thought on kind of the future of some of these older cars.